How do you create worlds that feel truly alive? From characters that feel like they have their own lives and agendas outside of the world of the protagonist, to bustling cities full of the sights and sounds of people going about their daily life, or to the chaotic yet harmonious flow and movement of nature. Hey friends, I'm Christian, and I'm developing a 2D narrative roguelite game called Ethos Augur, a game which attempts to blend the intrigue and world building of a story-driven game with the excitement and energy of a roguelite. Today I'll be sharing some of the techniques that I have been using to add life into my game world, and updating you on the progress of my indie game. I'll be sharing links to any resources I used while making my game in the hopes that it can drive some traffic towards those creators and help other devs who are dealing with the same problems that I am. I also want to thank you all for the overwhelming response to the previous video. It really gave me the encouragement I needed to keep moving forward with the game, and I felt really honored that so many of you wanted to see more. So without further ado, let's see what I've been working on. Part 1, Character Interaction. Let's start with the simple stuff, making the characters in our game feel more lifelike. For one thing, I was getting sick of looking at the static characters just standing around the room. So to fix that, I did some investigating on adding idle animations to the characters. I've mentioned that I'm not very artistically inclined, but rather than work with an artist, I was hoping to save a bit of money here, so I decided to try my hand at doing this myself. I started by looking through tutorials on YouTube, and I found Adam C. Eunice's tutorial on pixel art animation, and I was not disappointed. I learned that for the animation to feel more natural, it was important to have a lead of sorts, and by that I mean the character's chests would rise before their torso on the inhale, and after the exhale, they would slowly settle into place. With the principles I learned in that video, I was able to translate it over to my relatively small pixel size and create an animation that I was happy with. After the first one, I then had to do the same animation for the other 10 characters, in total 35 unique animations. Sometimes game dev is really just moving pixels around for 5 hours. Anyway, I like the result. As a finishing touch, I tweaked the settings in-game so that the characters weren't all inhaling and exhaling at the same time, and now I'm feeling like the effect is sold quite well. Next came the dialogue system. Dialogue in Ethos Augur is hugely important since this is half roguelite and half narrative game with branching decision trees. I needed to implement a dialogue system which would allow selecting from a list of options so that we could implement those branching decisions. And I wanted the system to also show off portraits of the characters so I could better showcase their emotions. For this, I ended up following Peyton Burnham's branching dialogue system tutorial, which I'll link in the description. Peyton is a joy to listen to, and he's excellent at breaking things down, so I'd encourage you to check out his tutorials if you're looking to build your own game. This system worked pretty well as outlined in the tutorial, but in order to make it work a bit better for me, I ended up tweaking it just a bit so that I could keep my script in a separate script file, and changing the draw handling so that I would draw to the UI layer instead of directly on the screen, since this would interfere with all the shaders I'd already implemented. The dialogue system allows for a lot of emotion to come through, and I'm really quite happy with it. What really shines here are the character portraits, which give this cozy yet unsettling kind of vibe that is exactly what I was hoping for. I mentioned in the last video, but shout out again to Marwan on Fiverr for creating these for Ethos Augur. Lastly, we all know that people don't just stand in one spot all day. I have added pathfinding into the game, but you don't see it here. I'm tying all of the movement and dialogue to specific beats within the story. So rather than have people move on a set schedule, for example, you'll often find people in a small selection of places depending on how far you've progressed through the story. Think of Hades as narrative progression, where after each run, you can interact with characters who will be found in different spots, saying different things depending on how far you've progressed through the level. I may later regret comparing myself to Hades, which is known for its script with over 20,000 lines of dialogue, but hey, shoot for the moon, right? Part 2, Nature and Natural Elements. One of the simplest ways to add variety to a game is through creating an environment or weather system that has a lot of variations. In the real world, we don't just have sunshine or rain, we have all sorts of subtle changes in between, from a light drizzle to a storm. I became a bit fixated on this concept, and I've put a lot of work towards a much more comprehensive weather system. It's worth noting that weather in the game is also tied to story beats. The world of Ethos Augur is built on the desire of living beings being a fundamental force of reality, like gravity, so it makes sense that the actions of the player can even influence the weather. Last month I was playing Enter the Gungeon, looking for some inspiration for the roguelike sections of Ethos Augur, when I noticed my character's reflection in the water. A few of you had commented on the last video mentioning that the terrain needed a bit more variety, so I set about adding puddles into my game to add some texture to the paths outside. To accomplish this, I had to learn a lot more about surfaces in Game Maker in order to achieve the look I was going for. I would have to first create a few different puddle sprites in Sprite and import them into the game, then create a puddle object which would be responsible for drawing the puddle on screen. Then I would update the puddle's draw event so that the character's reflection would also be drawn within the puddle itself. This is using something called an alpha mask, so I could limit the reflection contents to be within the puddle space, only where the puddle had an alpha greater than 0. And lastly, I would update that same event so that the puddle would draw little expanding circles out from wherever the player stepped on the puddle. The first steps were quite easy. Drawing puddles in Sprite took a few tries, but even an amateur artist like me was capable of making a blob. Next up, I attempted to write some code to draw the puddles in and get the character sprite to reflect within the puddle space. I ended up struggling with this a lot. First, I had to start drawing the character onto the puddle surface instead of onto the application surface, which was straightforward. What took a little longer was getting the alpha mask to work, so only ensuring that the puddle was used as a mask and the character's reflection would only appear in that space. After a lot of time spent poring over Game Maker's documentation and Googling my way through, I found a few settings that I'd gotten wrong, and voila, reflection was drawing properly in the puddle. I was still a bit unhappy with the overall look of the puddles, so I had the puddle draw itself several times with different opacity levels and coloring to give it this greater illusion of depth, getting darker towards the center and lighter towards the outsides. I also added some movement to the outside of the puddle so it wouldn't look as static and out of place with the dynamics of the rest of the level. I think it ended up looking pretty good. Lastly, and quite easily thankfully, I added in the circles that get created in the puddle when the character steps inside. Since I had already laid the groundwork with the surfaces in the alpha mask, this was as easy as drawing a circle and expanding it when a character was moving and made contact with the puddle space. I think this helped sell the effect as well, which wasn't really working on its own when the character reflection was all that was showing. Next, it was time to add fire. I was reading through some of your feedback on the particle effects for the power system, which I intend to talk about more, along with the dungeon generation in the next video. It got me thinking that fluid simulations might be a nice approach for creating more natural flowing powers and abilities. I decided to start with adding fire to sconces throughout the game world. Static fire seemed easier after all. Next was deciding how exactly I was going to go about adding fluid simulations. I found this cool plugin called Fluid Dynamics on the Game Maker Marketplace. I was really impressed with the visuals and eager to try and implement this within my game too. So I downloaded it, launched the demo, and boom, real fire within the demo. When I tried to replicate the effect in my game, yeah, that didn't end up going so well. I could make a fireball of sorts appear on the screen briefly, but everything was all wrong. In the end, sometimes just starting from the beginning is the best approach. As much as it is nice to take shortcuts, there's no shortcut to understanding something new. I copied the object from the demo, went through all of its code to understand what could and couldn't be ripped out, and ended up being able to draw some fire objects in the room. This looked amazing, way better than I'd hoped for, and this plugin allows for the player to interact with the fire. More on that to come in the power system update next time. The only problem? More than a few fires and the game slowed to a crawl. I hadn't optimized the drawing of the fluid container, so it was simulating for the entire room, which was not ideal. Finally, I was able to figure out how to draw smaller containers and get the coordinates right in the space. There wasn't really much of a process to this, short of trying new tweaks over and over, taking a break here and there, and finally having an epiphany at my desk where I actually understood what I was doing. Now I could finally draw more than a handful of fires in the room. Now I had some better weather effects, puddles like I'd seen in Enter the Gungeon, and fire effects which I could use not just in the environment, but as a part of the graphics for the power system. Oh, and I also added butterflies. On bright sunny days, you might see these little guys flying around. This video is about the details after all, and I consider butterflies to be important details. I've also been working on building out the rest of the house interiors and filling them with lots of items that fit the setting and also teach you a little bit more about the people that live there. Speaking of interiors, that leads me into Part 3, Changes from Community Feedback. You might have noticed, but the interiors look a lot different from the last video. That's because I took the advice of a few commenters and retextured every interior asset so that it fits the flatter style of the exterior. This took ages, and it does mean that interiors take a little bit longer to create, since new assets have an extra recolor and retexture step every time I decide to bring one in, but I think it makes the art style stronger and more cohesive. I've also added adjustments to the game's camera to flow better from interiors to exteriors, since the interior space was very zoomed in previously. I also upped the easing, so the camera will ease in and out of motion just a tad more, which I think adds smoothness to the look and feel of the game. The last big change was to make some adjustments to the shadows. Some of you had mentioned that it looked a bit like the character didn't have their own shadow, and this was because of two reasons. One, the interiors didn't have shadows, and two, the default time for launching my game is noon, and the exterior shadows are hard to see behind the character at noon, which is when I've set the sun to be directly overhead. I really did like the look of the skewed shadows outside. I wanted to keep that look but avoid shadows being invisible, so instead of making a huge adjustment, I added an easing effect to the shadows so they follow a cosine curve. What that means is, instead of shadows moving in a linear line from the leftmost side of the screen to the right, shadows will instead prefer to be at either the left or right side, following an exponential curve which spends less time in the center position. Now it's less likely that a player will spend much time at all looking at the shadows directly behind, but we still maintain the realism of the sun arcing through the sky overhead. For interior spaces, I decided to make my own version of ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion usually means the shadows that get created between objects when they're close together, and in my case, that means an object and the ground. There wasn't much to be found online for this besides making a circular sprite and shoving it under the player's feet. That wasn't really good enough, in my opinion, so I ended up writing my own system, which would take the player's bounding box, use that to determine how large their shadow would be, and draw a pixelated circle at their feet. The trick here was that drawing a regular circle looked a little out of place, so this pixelated circle is created using overlapping rectangles at specified points. I was pretty happy with the effect. I think it added a lot of depth to the indoor spaces, especially now that the assets were matching the flatter art style of the exteriors. But I'd love to hear your thoughts too. Now as for what comes next, I'm working on a video showing off the Hades-inspired dungeon mechanics and Nen-inspired power system of Ethos Augur. I know a lot of you have been requesting to see more there, and I can promise that this will be what I cover in the next video. I'll also have a Steam page up shortly, so be on the lookout. I finally managed to save up for it, and I've reached out to an artist, and I think you guys won't be disappointed. All that said, please drop a like and consider subscribing to see more. If there's anything you want to see in a future video, please let me know in the comments. I'll be uploading videos as I go through this process. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.